very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, I am happy that I can rise today to speak to my report stage amendments on Bill C-24. There are four main amendments that really would, in a major way, adjust this bill. This is, in all ways, a very poor bill that would have a detrimental effect, not only to what we're doing here in the House of Commons, but just as importantly, what's happening across the country in terms of regional economic development. I want to begin by just recapping what Bill C-24 does. Essentially, Bill C-24 papers over the ministerial changes that the Liberals made when they took office 2 years ago. 2 years later, they're here in Parliament asking us to bless what they did. To remind the House what those changes are, first of all, the Liberals are seeking to give ministers of state full ministerial status and full ministerial salaries to boot. And secondly, what this bill does is permanently scrap the 6 regional development ministerial positions. They've also added a provision to let them swear in the future an additional 3 full-rank ministers yet to be named. We can only imagine what they may have planned with those 3 additional ministers. But, Mr. Speaker, let me begin. There's only 10 minutes, so I'm going to just speak briefly about one of the issues that I've spoken about before, and that is the elimination of the economic regional development ministers. It's something that has not gotten a lot of media profile, but something for those of us who aren't from Ottawa or Toronto or representing Toronto areas, for those of us from Western Canada, from the Atlantic provinces, from Quebec, from Northern Canada. This is a huge blow to what is happening in our areas, whereby we had ministers in previous governments, previous Conservative governments and Liberal governments, we had ministers who were directly responsible for their regional economic development portfolio. That meant that they would be able to, at the cabinet table, speak directly to issues surrounding their regions, and they would be in charge of their regional economic development agency. So, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister made a decision that he wanted to change that, and let me quote what the Prime Minister said this summer in Charlottetown. He told an interviewer that his decision to appoint one minister from Toronto to run all of the economic development agencies, for example, ACOA, was, and I quote, a way of reducing the kind of politics that we've seen from regional development agencies. Mr. Speaker, what a cynical slur, not just against, at that moment, Atlantic Canadians, but it was actually across all of the regional development areas and the regions of this country. To somehow suggest that ministers from Quebec, ministers from Western Canada, ministers from Northern Canada, ministers from Atlantic Canada could not advocate for their regions and bring issues and good projects forward without it becoming political shows that he has zero confidence in the rest of his ministers and seems to only think that one minister from Toronto is able to get the balance right between representing the regions, making solid decisions and not being political. Mr. Speaker, I think that there's so much more to be said on this, but I will have to wait till I give my speech at third reading to talk a little bit more about the regional economic development minister issue. I do want to go to another part of this bill, Bill C-24, when the government House Leader introduced this, and she hailed this as a bill that would equalize the status of ministers. Members will recall the great fanfare about gender equality, a gender-equal cabinet when the Liberals took office, because it's 2015, we were told, was the reason. And then, lo and behold, the fine print was released, and it turned out that the junior ministers of state roles were all assigned to, guess what? Women. Yeah, but don't worry, the Liberals said, even though we're giving all the women the smaller roles, it's okay, because we're going to pay them just as much as the full ministers get. And in fact, PMO Communications Director is quoted in the Toronto Star saying, we need to change from a status perspective to their salaries so that they get full ministerial salaries. Wow. Thanks a lot. You know what? Don't worry, ladies. You're going to get the junior role, but we're going to pay you for the full role. But you won't actually be able to bring full ministerial memos to cabinet. You're not going to have deputy ministers. You're not going to have a full portfolio. But don't worry your pretty little heads, because you're going to get paid the full amount. Boy, oh boy, what an insult, an absolute insult. But you know what? Don't take my word for it. And there's a professor that testified, Margot Young, a law professor from the University of British Columbia, with a specialty in gender equality. She appeared before the Government Operations Committee. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what she said. For starters, she said, and I quote, "This particular piece of legislation really doesn't, as far as I can see, have much to do with gender equality." To those Liberals who showed us in platitudes, the professor said, "Don't describe something that is clearly not about gender equality as speaking to gender equality. That's disingenuous." And she said, as for that, because it's 2015 quip, the professor told the committee, "It loses a key leadership moment to articulate and shape opinion about what it really means to actually have a woman in position of equality, in position of leadership, and a position of power." And I think that that's where we have seen from the very beginning, this Prime Minister is very good at quips and saying the right thing, but in following through on his actions when it comes to many, many issues, but specifically today we're talking about being a feminist and treating women equally. We have seen a lot of talk, but not always a lot of action and substance. So the Liberals are definitely obsessed with optics, but when something is presented or framed, it is of the utmost concern. This is how Professor Young graded their efforts on Bill C-24. She said, "I think to frame it as a piece of legislation that speaks substantively to the issue of gender equality in cabinet composition is wrong and it's dangerous." It sounds, Mr. Speaker, like she gave this bill an F as far as gender equality. And that was the main point that she was talking about. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, I think that there are many areas where we've seen this Prime Minister fail as far as gender equality, and as I mentioned, in this specific one where these ministers are given junior portfolios, but they then are not given the full responsibility. You know, we've seen this on a number of other times where we have a Prime Minister who has an opportunity to really stand up and take direct action that will help women. I'm thinking of a couple of examples that come to mind. Helping Yazidi women and girls who are tormented, persecuted, and much, much worse. And this Prime Minister has had so many opportunities to allow them refuge and safety here in Canada, and he hasn't done it. Mr. Speaker, we've seen it, and this is a very difficult topic, but it has to be said. When most recently he removed female genital mutilation out of our citizenship guide. A very important message to send to the world, that Canada is not a place where FGM will be tolerated or allowed. And instead of making that statement, he shied away. He got scared, he got worried, and so he withdrew it. We saw it previously with Liberals when they had an opportunity to stand up for women on reserves who didn't have property rights, a basic right. But Liberals get scared when the big bullies say, you know what, don't threaten us, don't threaten our power. The Liberals get scared, and the Prime Minister gets scared to stand up for women. So, listen, I believe that this bill in so many ways is wrong, certainly on the economic development side. But to send a message to women, and you know what, it's been 2 years in, I've seen some really good cabinet ministers, women cabinet ministers who maybe were given these positions because it was, as he said, 2015. And I think that many are growing and have grown, but we've also seen some of them put in positions where they have been destined to fail. And it's very disappointing to see. We need to, not just the government and the Prime Minister, but all of us need to stand up for women who truly need help, women who are systemically discriminated against and hurt. Many of those times that's in other countries. And instead of giving just lip service here in Canada by saying to a woman you can have an equal pay but you're not going to have equal responsibility is disingenuous. And it hurts the authentic feminist movement, which is really about true equality for women. And so this bill is damaging, and we are disappointed to see it continue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.